I'm Nancy Rathbun from Completely Quilted. Thank you for purchasing our Curve It Up block of the month. This is your final month, which includes all of the finishing fabrics that you will need, including the binding. So our quilt is finished with layout option 1, which includes the teal fabric, the background, and then there's a little orange outer border. And then we also have included the fabrics for layout option 2, if that's how you want to complete your quilt, which is a little bit quicker option. And I'm going to be showing you the demonstration for cutting and piecing both of those. So let's start with the layout option 1. So with layout option 1, you're going to have 3 colors for your border. You're going to have the inner part, what they call the border focus print, which is aqua in our sample. Then you're going to have the outer edge border, which is orange, and then you're going to have the same background fabric that we've used from the rest of the quilt. So you're going to cut these, the rectangles that your pattern describes, and the sizes for each section of the sashings. So the first curve that we're going to cut is going to be the turquoise piece, which is your border focus print. So when we use the quick curve ruler, we want to make sure that we've lined up that 1-inch line with the edge of the fabric, and we're always going to center between the 1.5 and 10.5. I'm going to make that cut. So that's extra. And then I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to do the same thing for the other side. So we have this really cool elliptical shape. That's going to be a lot of those cut for your sashings and the outer border. Then you're going to have your orange fabric and your background fabrics, and these are going to be cut the same way. So I'm just going to layer both of these up so that you can see that they're going to be cut exactly the same. They're the same size as well. So same thing, we want to center our fabric between the 1.5 and the 10.5, and we're going to line up our ruler with a 2 3/4 inch line. Here. So the vertical line here. So we're cutting a little bit different angle. So that's what our pieces look like now. So what you're going to have is sections that you can sew together. So for this setting, you're going to have multiple sections sewn different ways. So these sections sewn together are going to be for the sashings that are going to go all the way around the outside, and you're also going to have segments that are sewn with the background fabric on each side. That will be sewn in between the blocks for the inner part of the sashings. You're also going to have some cornerstones that you're going to be sewing for the finishing as well. So these cornerstones don't have any curved piecing on them. They're going to be straight piecing. I have one corner already sewn, but these blocks will all be sewn with a square on each corner. So for this particular block, I'm marking from corner to corner, and I'm sewing right on that line. And then on this corner, I've already sewn and trimmed 1/4 inch seam allowance. So some blocks will have a white square sewn on all 4 corners. So you would just continue to lay it down and mark it. Some of your blocks are going to have 2 background corners sewn, trimmed and then pressed, and then they're going to have 2 of the orange pieces sewn. And then you're going to have 4 corner blocks that will just have 1 background, and then we'll have 3 of the orange pieces sewn. So I'll stitch this and you can see how that finishes. The segments for layout option 1, you're always going to start with one of the pieces that has the straight edge, and you're going to put right sides together, that curved element that goes in the middle on top, making sure that you have 1/4 inch of that underneath fabric sticking out beyond that. Always like to stop with my needle down in the fabric, so as I'm stitching I can stop and reposition my fabric by gently lifting up my presser foot and moving those fabrics back together instead of pulling and stretching them and dragging them as I sew. My Bernina has a freehand system that allows me to lift up my presser foot just a little bit with my knee. So I've stitched that curve. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew my next curve piece on. So for this particular piece, I'm going to have a background fabric on one side and then that orange fabric on the other. Same thing. I'm going to position my background fabric with that straight edge over here on my left, and then I'm going to position that blue fabric with 1/4 of an inch of the underneath fabric coming from the outside. So it doesn't matter what color you're sewing to each side, whether it's going to be the background fabric on both sides or one orange and one background fabric. They're going to be stitched and squared up the exact same way. Now I'm ready to press this and then we'll square that up. Now I'm ready to square up my pieces for my layout option number 1. So I'm going to square these up using my quick curve ruler, and I'm going to be looking at the points here and here on my elongated piece. Be squared up to 5.5 by 8.5. So I'm going to center in between the 2.5 and the 3, about 2 3/4 inch is where I want that opening to be on my elongated pieces. I'm going to take those cuts. It's okay if you trim off the points because these are going to be blunt edges. They're not going to be perfect points. You do want it to be even, however, on both sides. So I just left a little bit up here that I need to trim off to make it 5.5 by 8.5. So they're all going to be trimmed up that same size. So even the ones that have a background on top and bottom are going to be trimmed up the same size. And here's a sample of how your layout option number 1 is going to be sewn. So you're going to have your segments sewed in pairs, and then you'll have cornerstones in between them, whether it's going to be for your top and bottom strips or the strips in between your blocks. So I would suggest to follow the pattern instructions and lay out your quilt and then start stitching them together. Option 2, you're going to have curves to cut from your rectangle segments, much like we did with our layout 1 option. So for the green fabric, you can stack multiple of these at a time if you're comfortable with that. And we're going to center our ruler between the 1.5 and 10.5 markings. And then we're going to line the inside edge of our ruler up with the 2 3/4 inch marking line vertically. And those are our green segments. Then you're going to be cutting your white background segment, positioned between the 1.5 and 10.5 inch line, and then the 1 inch vertical line here. So these will be sewn with a gray section in between, like this. So I'm going to show you how to cut that gray section now. This is going to be cut a little bit differently. So instead of having squares to start with, we're going to start with our strips. So when we start, I'm just going to line up the 1.5 and 10.5 inch marked lines, and just going to make sure that that curve is cutting through those points of the fabric. So that gives me a nice curve to start with. Now what I'm going to use on my ruler is I'm going to be using this dashed line, the curve here, to line up the edge of that curved cut that I already took. And I'm going to continue to line up my ruler between the 1.5 and 10.5 inch markings. And I'm going to continue to cut those curves. So I'll just keep lining up my ruler with the dashed line and then the strip between the 1.5 and the 10.5. So you'll be cutting all of these segments from strips like this. Now I'm ready to stitch my layout option 2 sample. So I'm going to have my green and my gray sewn together, and when I position these, I want to make sure that that green fabric that I have on the bottom has 1/4 inch of a dog ear hanging out. And I'm going to sew and then just reposition my fabric gently without stretching it until I reach the end. So I have those 2 pieces sewn together. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew on my background piece. So this time I have my gray fabric here facing up, and I'm going to position my background fabric on top with that 1/4 inch of the gray dog ear hanging out from underneath. Now I have these 3 segments sewn together, and I'm ready to square this up. I'm ready to square up my layout option 2 block. I want to make sure that I'm looking at the curve and centering those between the 2 and 4 line on my ruler. So I'm going to look at my 2 and 4 lines here and here, and I want to make sure that it's centered between that position. So these blocks are going to be squared up 7 by 8.5. Sometimes I have to move that up or down depending on kind of, how much fabric I have on top and bottom to actually cut off to make it the 8.5 dimension. And your quick curve ruler is 7 inches wide, so it's a perfect ruler for squaring up these blocks as well as cutting your curves. So I'm going to turn that over and then just going to finish cutting it 7 inches by 8.5. So all of these blocks will be squared up that same dimension. So I've gone ahead and I've pieced one of my corner units already for layout option 2. So layout option 2 has corner elements that you'll sew 4 of. Then it also has your curved elements that we just pieced and squared up. So you're going to be sewing 2 of those curved elements together, and then you're going to have another segment in between 2 that's going to have straight segments. So these 2 squares have been squared up, and then I will just pin them because they're the exact same size, and sew my top and bottom borders, and then my sides and in between, just like a regular quilt is sashed. So this is what sample of what layout number 2 will look like. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed completing your Curve It Up Block of the Month quick curve ruler, or now the new mini quick curve ruler. There's lots of patterns available from Sew Kind of Wonderful. Come check us out and see what we have in stock.